In August 1945, Porter Flournoy Turner was lynched in Druid Hills, a neighborhood in DeKalb County in Atlanta, Georgia. Years later, the Equal Justice Initiative outlined a bold vision for a national memorial and a history telling for lynching victims located not in any one space, but instead dispersed to and sited in the communities in which these lynchings occurred. This vision has been accomplished here in DeKalb County by a diverse coalition of people who have worked to have a marker installed honoring Mr. Turner. The successful installation of this important marker gives us an opportunity to look closer, to be sure we are seeing a more complete history. The research done about Mr. Turner reminds us of history that has long gone unseen in a historically white neighborhood and has been forgotten by all but his family. Mr. Turner's story is an American story, the story of a man trying to provide for his family, working multiple jobs for a better life. Seeing and remembering the story of Mr. Porter Turner is a part of recognizing the complete history not only of Druid Hills, but of our nation.
At the center of all faiths is the belief that what we believe must correlate to action in the world. To name a few, in Judaism, this is embodied by the radical concept of tikkun olam, a call to repair the world. In Hinduism, it is a keen sense of awareness of the laws of karma, that what goes around comes around. In Christianity, it is the mandate to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And in Buddhism, it is to strive to reach a place of altruism and enlightenment so that mind, body, and spirit are aligned. Brothers and sisters, we gather recognizing that there has been a breach in this contract between the divine and humanity. We gather to tell the truth, knowing that the truth will set us free. And the truth is this, that a great sin, a separation from God rooted in self-interest and a failure to see the beauty in our difference, better known and embodied in the concept of white supremacy, has and continues to wreak havoc on Black bodies. We gather to condemn it, to call it out for what it is, evil, and to declare that every time this weapon forms against us, it shall not prosper. We gather with somber hearts to commemorate the life of Porter Turner, a son, a husband, a father, somebody, a child of God, whose life was violently taken away from him by way of lynching. We gather to make it known that Porter Turner's blood was not spilled in vain. We gather to honor him as an ancestor forever in our hearts, guiding us on a journey to confront our nation's past, not to revel in it, but to let it shape our future filled with hope and right relationships. In the Yoruba language of West Africa, Ashe is a word that simply means let it be. The people of West Africa held on to this declaration with the knowledge that the power of whatever is spoken from the tongue will come to fruition and bring about change. And so, for the assurance that Porter Turner's story will never again go untold, Ashe. For the courage of all who want to say and do something to create a more just world, Ashe. for the wisdom to know that no one can do the work of racial justice alone and that we need community. Ashe. For the strength to persevere, knowing that though we have come a long way, we have a long way to go. Ashe. For the testimonies that will be shared long after we're gone, that we weren't bystanders in the fight for racial justice, but that we were harbingers of equity and justice and abundant life for all. Ashe.
Hello, I am D.E. Smith. I am the chairperson of the NAACP DeKalb's DeKalb Remembrance Project. Now that's a mouthful, I know. And what is that? The DeKalb Remembrance Project is a coalition of about 70 individuals and organizations who came together to get to honor the victims of racial terrorism in DeKalb County and to start a dialogue on race in DeKalb County. So we started doing research and we came across information about EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, and their work on lynching in America. So we contacted them and found out that they were erecting a museum and a memorial to lynching victims all across the nation. Well, we took a trip to Montgomery, just loaded up a bus load of folks and went down there. If you haven't been, go. Put it on your bucket list. We found out that they were asking local communities to erect monuments to their local victims of racial terrorism. So we signed up so that we can get some honor for the victims in DeKalb County. We came back home, we wrote all the proposals, and a funny thing happened. I tell everybody this is God's project. It's not mine, it's not the NAACP. This project belonged to God because so many miracles happened along the way. I said there was a coalition of 70 individuals and organizations. We didn't have to contact a single one of them. When we got back home and we had signed up and sent in all the proposals, people started to contact us. People we would never have met or encountered in any other way. And they contacted us, said, we heard what you're doing, we want to get involved. So we started having monthly meetings and everybody had input what we wanted to do. And EJI, God bless their souls, was so helpful in telling us how we could get it all done. What we decided, the coalition decided, we wanted to have 3 markers put up in DeKalb County. There would be one in Lithonia, and that one would honor Mr. Reuben Hudson and 2 unknown victims of lynchings. And another one would be in the Druid Hills area to honor Mr. Porter Turner. The 3rd marker we wanted to install would honor all the victims in DeKalb County. And that marker we decided to have erected in front of the DeKalb County Courthouse in Decatur. Now the reason we wanted it there was the location would be so symbolic. These people were denied justice when they were alive. So we wanted to put them as close to justice, to the halls of justice as possible. We made a presentation to the DeKalb County Board of Commissioners, explained to them what we wanted to do, and they were so enthusiastic, every single commissioner. approved of the project and wanted to get involved. We also went to the county CEO, Mr. Thurman. He was also enthusiastic, and his only question to us was, what do you want from the county? And when we told him where we wanted to put it, he says, okay, you got it. It was the enthusiasm and the cooperation we received from everybody was just out of this world. Now, each one of those marker locations, each community they were located in is unique. And you have to work with the community, with the people in the community. You have to acknowledge and accept their uniqueness. When we got to Druid Hills, that was another story. Now, the location in Druid Hills is right in the shadow of Emory University. There were very few African Americans living there back when Mr. Porter Turner was killed, and there are very few now. But we knew we had to have a local community coalition to bring the community together to get this project done. The other unique thing about Druid Hills is that it is located within the city of Atlanta, that portion of Atlanta that's in DeKalb County. So you had two major governments you had to deal with, and we needed somebody to do that. So we formed another coalition, you might say a subcommittee of a subcommittee, and that's the Druid Hills Coalition. And they got together, and they have pulled all the strings and brought all the people together. And the marker for Druid Hills, I am so happy to say, is going up. The other thing we wanted to do was to collect soil samples. And we got the soil samples. Now we still have to get the soil samples from Lithonia. But the ones for the Druid Hills, they're ready. We're going to send one to EJI. There will be one that will go to the DeKalb History Center. One has been given to the family members. This was God's project. This is God's project. And he just kept on pushing. All we had to do was step back and get out of his way. Because despite Mr. COVID, all three markers are now in the ground. They are the only thing honoring the victims of racial terrorism in DeKalb County. There are plenty, as you know, plenty of markers, monuments, etc. in the county, including one carved into the side of a mountain, honoring the people who committed the terrorist acts. But these markers are the only thing to honor and to remember the victims of racial terrorism in DeKalb County, Georgia. One thing that was so moving, when we had the soil collection in one of the locations connected to the death of Mr. Turner, they came out and participated in digging of that soil. That soil was placed in a jar which will be sent off to the museums and the DeKalb History Center with Mr. Porter Turner's name on it. It was just so moving to see his great-grand nieces and nephews there helping to dig the soil where their uncle died and or was killed. This project was so important. It was on God's timeline. And if you look at what we're doing today with these markers, remembering, recognizing, and honoring the victims of racial terrorism in DeKalb County. And you look at what is going on in the world today, this project could not be more timely.
My name is Teresa Hardy. I'm the president of the NAACP DeKalb County branch here in Decatur, Georgia. want to start out just having a conversation about why the NAACP decided to do the Remembrance Project and how it came to. We took a trip to Montgomery to visit the EGI Museum. And after we returned from the trip, everyone that was on the trip decided that we had to do more. We had to bring back the memories of victims of lynching. And we wanted to educate the community. So, under the leadership of Attorney D.E. Smith, we formed the coalition. And the coalition decided to name the project Remembrance Project. In this Remembrance Project, there were going to be several activities. One where we were going to bring interfaith community together. One, we were going to engage the youth. Secondly, we were going to also bring in the government as well as businesses, because we wanted everyone to know the history of the victims of lynching in DeKalb County. So in the middle of this project, we were also in the middle of the Confederacy monument movements. And we had done a couple of protests as it relates to removing the Confederate monument from the Decatur Square. In our decision to move forward with bringing the lynching marker to DeKalb County, we wanted to keep the two projects separate. And I'm so glad that we did, because we were able to remove the Confederate monument, at the same time install a lynching marker right in front of our new courthouse, which gives the opportunity for those victims to be right in front of the courthouse so people can see them on a daily basis. And then we moved on to having another lynching marker actually installed in Lithonia. Remember, when we first started, it was going to actually be two markers coming to DeKalb County. And we were so proud to actually have one in Lithonia and one in DeKalb County. But as the project grew, we were able to connect with more people and found out more history as it relates to victims of lynching in DeKalb County. And we are going to install a third lynching marker in DeKalb County. When I think about when we first started with the lynching marker, I really didn't know how I was going to feel. I told Miss D that if we were going to do this, how we were going to make sure that no one felt a certain way. And I say that because in the Black community, we never talked about lynching. If you were to ask someone what happened to one of our ancestors, they would never say someone was lynched. They would say they killed him. They would just say they killed him. And so that resonated with me as we went along with the project. And then some things happened. Some things that brought it to life as to why it was important to have these markers placed in DeKalb County. Victims of lynching was a mob terroristic act. And we are still going through terroristic acts today in 2020 and 2021. And then as of today, I think about the fact that our governor just signed a bill that puts us back in the Jim Crow days. We're now calling that Jim Crow 2.0. Even though there's not a lynching piece to it, but the day that you're taking back our rights, it removes the power that we have to make a change in the world. So you asked me today, how relevant is this project? This project is so relevant that the youth of today will be able to live through and understand what happened in 1800s and know that it's happening in 2020, and the fact that they can actually change something on today. I would like to personally thank the NAACP DeKalb County branch for allowing us to do this project. I would like to thank all the members of the Remembrance Project. The coalition building was powerful. We would like to also thank personally the CEO, Michael Thurman, and our DeKalb County Board of Commissioners for making sure that they voted unanimously. We also would like to thank the City of Atlanta for their unanimous vote. We also would like to thank Mayor Shamika Reynolds and their City Council for making this possible in DeKalb County. Let us now thank all of the citizens that have supported us and will continue to support us by visiting these markers so that you could understand the history of mob terroristic acts of lynching. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Becky Evans, State Representative for House District 83, serving unincorporated DeKalb, portions of Decatur, portions of Atlanta, and the neighborhood of Druid Hills. The sickness of racism and white supremacy is an American condition. Racism and white supremacy is a part of our culture. We must heal this sickness at every level of our culture, including legislatively. I'm proud that the Georgia legislature passed a hate crimes bill in 2020, and this past week that we repealed the citizens arrest law, a 158-year-old law that was designed for citizens to arrest runaway slaves. I'm proud to read to you House Resolution 1406, which was entered into the record for the state of Georgia in March of 2020. A resolution memorializing the 4 known victims of lynching in DeKalb County, Georgia, and honoring the work of the Remembrance Project initiative of the NAACP DeKalb branch, which seeks to recognize and memorialize incidents of racial terrorism perpetuated throughout the United States and in DeKalb County. Whereas, between 1877 and 1950, racial terror lynchings of African Americans by white mobs in DeKalb County created a climate and a legacy of violence and injustice that has not been previously acknowledged in DeKalb County. Whereas, on the night of August 21st, 1945, Porter Flournoy Turner was operating a white-owned passenger cab. On the morning of August 22nd, his body was discovered on the lawn of a physician's home in Druid Hills. He had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest and back. His cab was found abandoned on the curb across the street. And whereas Mr. Turner's death was classified as an unsolved homicide until June of 1946, when it was announced that informants working with the Attorney General of the state of Georgia had witnessed members of the Cavalier Club, the strong arm of the Ku Klux Klan, tasked with terroristic raids, boasting of the killing during a covert meeting. No one was ever arrested for the lynching of Porter Turner. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives that the members of this body memorialize the 4 known victims of lynching in DeKalb County, Georgia, and honor the work of the Remembrance Project initiative of the NAACP DeKalb branch. As a neighbor and as a state representative, I am proud and honored to be a part of the DeKalb Remembrance Project.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Ide from the Atlanta City Council. On City Council, I represent District 6, which includes the historic Druid Hills neighborhood. I'm honored to be here today as we recognize and memorialize the lynching of Porter Turner in the Druid Hills neighborhood. When the Druid Hills Civic Association and the Olmsted Linear Park came to me and told me the story of Mr. Porter's murder right here in the city of Atlanta in Druid Hills, I was happy to help find a way to bring his story to light and to the public and to find a public way to acknowledge his death. They had been working with the Remembrance Project, the NAACP, and the Equal Justice Initiative to recognize as many individuals, lynching victims, as they could and to find this way to publicly acknowledge them and tell their story. We worked together to find a public place to do this, which ended up being in Oak Grove Park. And it was important to me to have this in the public so as many people, residents and visitors, could learn about Mr. Porter and his history and this dark period of our history in Atlanta and our country. So often victims of lynching went unacknowledged by the justice system and by law enforcement and just faded into history as individuals. And so queer work has been done to identify individuals such as Porter Turner who were the victims of this racial terrorism. It's important that we say their names, we acknowledge their lives, and we acknowledge what was done to them. So that's what we're here to do for Mr. Porter Turner, who was murdered in 1945 in Druid Hills by a local group of the Ku Klux Klan. And by saying his name, by putting a marker, by telling the story, hopefully it will help us move forward in our work towards greater justice and equity and healing in the city of Atlanta.
Hi, my name is Yvette Weatherly. I'm involved in the Druid Hills Civic Association. I'm the Division II Chair. And I'm very proud of Druid Hills for recognizing Mr. Turner with a marker in a linear park and supporting it financially. I think that's very important. It's a very good thing that they're doing because lots of people have raised their families here and we know all about, how happy everybody is, but that's a history that I think it's good that it's being dealt with and recognized, and lots of people are going to walk by that marker and read about it and understand the complete history of Druid Hills.
Hello, my name is Toby Brooks, and I serve as the president of the board of the Olmsted Linear Park Alliance, or OLPA. OLPA is a park conservancy that for the last 20 years has preserved and maintained the Olmsted Linear Park, which is the centerpiece of the Druid Hills neighborhood in Atlanta. The board enthusiastically supports the placement of the Equal Justice Initiative's marker in Oak Grove Park to commemorate the life and horrific murder of Mr. Porter Turner. From the start, the board has been unanimous in our support for this project, and we applaud Sean Griffin and the local Atlanta team in their efforts to memorialize this tragic event in our neighborhood's history. The design of the Druid Hills neighborhood and the park were one of the last projects of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. In addition to being the father of American landscape architecture, Olmsted was also a journalist, and during his lifetime he traveled extensively in the South prior to the Civil War, documenting the institution of slavery and questioning its purpose. We feel that it's appropriate somehow that the marker that commemorates the injustice of the lynching of Mr. Turner should be placed in a park that was designed by an abolitionist 50 years before Mr. Turner's death. Part of OLPA's mission is to preserve and pass on the history of this beautiful Atlanta neighborhood. But it's important as we do that we recognize and educate ourselves about the ugly parts of that history at the same time that we commend and remember the good. We are proud to have this marker in the park.
On April 3, 1892, a double lynch occurred in DeKalb County. In honor of the victims whose names we do not know and past we cannot properly acknowledge, I will be reciting a poem, Freedom. They say we'll never get it. I believe when people hear the colored side of the story, injustice anywhere is an insult to justice everywhere. They chant and throw objects, but I'm not giving up. I feel like I could walk all night for freedom. Cops yell and block the roads and order people to go back. Groups of Caucasians chant in our faces and hold up signs, but all I can say is keep walking. There are thousands of people who have been victims to these crimes whose names we do not know, but to those whose names we do know, say them.
Porter Turner. A black taxi driver who served white passengers was found stabbed to death on a physician's lawn August 21st, 1945. As a young black woman, as well as a student at Druid Hills High School, I find it extremely eye-opening. And I think it's incredibly important that we not only highlight the lives that were lost, but bring awareness to the fact that these people responsible for his death were never held accountable. The four who were ill led to believe the worst was over. Why? Years and years have passed, and where's the C? Change in which those who participate in violent acts are H, held accountable for their lawlessness. E, every day is a blessing, and while they are gone, they aren't forgotten. D, deep-rooted is where you'll find the true issue. So in memory of all the lives that were lost, let's use the time and make an impact.
As we recognize the 4 documented lynchings in DeKalb County, we are reminded of Georgia's dark side. Lynchings are a part of our state of Georgia's past and present. Lynchings are not just hangings. They could be from shooting, torture, drowning, and being burned alive. Although it was not widely recognized till May of the past year, Ahmaud Arbery, at the young age of 25, became a victim to this heinous crime. Jogging resulted in his untimely death on February 23rd of 2020. We would like to honor all victims known and unknown to crimes of hate, regardless of where they come from, and we stand in solidarity with dismantling the effects of white supremacy each and every day.
Hello, my name is Adrian Carter, and I'm the researcher and archivist for the Druid Hills group of the DeKalb Remembrance Project. And I want to tell you a little bit about the archival work that's gone into the very important work of installing this marker. In the context of truth and reconciliation, archival research takes on an essential role. The idea of truth as it relates to lynching history is that really it's a history of silences and white complacency, record corruption, and what archival work does is try to break some of that down and uncover it, work it back. And that's what I've been working on with the story of Porter Turner with the help of his amazing family, and critically the work of AJC reporter Tia Mitchell, who initially tracked down the descendants of Porter Turner living in Atlanta and told their story for the first time publicly. Like so many lynching victims, the life and death of Porter Turner are not well documented, and there's very little left of him in the record. And for that reason, this work has been extremely difficult. But here's what we do know based on census records and address books, newspaper articles here and there, and a few other vital records. Porter Turner was born in the spring of 1895, just outside Greensboro, Georgia, about an hour and a half east of Atlanta. And he was born on a farm and worked on a farm as an early teenager alongside his brothers and his mom and his dad on the same land where his grandparents had been enslaved before the end of the Civil War. Really the most important document we have of Porter Turner in lieu of a photograph or anything else is a draft card he signed in 1918, signing up for the World War I draft, in which he signed his own name. And it's really the only document that has a trace of the living Porter Turner on it. In his mid-20s, he moved to Atlanta's 4th Ward and started a lifelong career in the auto industry. He worked as a mechanic, he worked as a porter, and a driver for Harry Sommers, Inc., which was a Chrysler dealership on Spring Street in Atlanta. And by night, he drove a taxi cab, and he was working, based on the 1940 census, over 60 hours a week to support his family. He met his wife, Lois Colbert, in the mid-1930s, and they had 2 sons, Porter Jr. and Adolphus. At the time of his death, they were 6 and 9 years old. It's in the context of this hardworking dad and husband that we really can get in touch with the atrocity and the blindsiding of his lynching, which occurred. He had just turned 50 years old, and really, for all intents and purposes, happened when the world's back was turned. This was almost exactly 2 weeks after the second bomb was dropped on Japan at the end of World War II, and a week before the signing of the surrender and the official end of the war. Atlanta, like New York and like all the Life magazine photos people are familiar with, was celebrating, people were in the streets, people were needing rides. And based on family oral history, we know that he was picking up white passengers as well as black passengers, which at the time was not only against Atlanta city ordinance, but was actively stopped by police. And in the late 40s, there are numerous instances in newspaper archives of harassment and random tickets for black taxi drivers. This was a targeted profession, especially with so many young white men returning from overseas who were all of a sudden needing jobs that, as a lot of people are familiar with, women had moved into, but also black Atlantans had moved into in cases where they weren't allowed to work before the war effort called for more. And really, it's this detail that emphasizes just the sheer power and systemic structure of racism that was working against black Atlantans like Porter Turner, and that led to his death. It was not only Jim Crow law, it was Atlanta police departments rife with Klansman membership. It was neighborhoods and citizens saying nothing and not reporting murders, lynchings, any number of crimes against black Americans. It was a culture of complacency and silence. The black-owned Atlanta Daily World, an important newspaper in American history, was the only news outlet to report anything having happened to Porter Turner. It was the morning after, and it's still the most detailed and accurate account we have of his final hours. Until a full year later, the Assistant Attorney General of Georgia, Dan Duke, working under a then progressive governor of Georgia, Ellis Arnold, was building a case to revoke the Ku Klux Klan's charter, which at the time was chartered officially by the state of Georgia and thus tax exempt. And they were basically trying to classify them for the first time as a terrorist hate group and closely associating them with the Nazi movement, which Americans by then were familiar with being a bad thing. But this was a radical notion in 1940s Atlanta. Unfortunately, whatever happened in the next few months, whether too much time had passed or no one would talk, which is typical, when it came time to bring it to court, Porter Turner's case was not a part of the state's case. Therefore, again, his story, his history goes quiet for decades. The truth is that no one was ever tried, no one was ever interrogated, no one was ever sentenced or held accountable for the lynching of Porter Turner. Porter Turner was driving his cab on August 21st, late at night after working a full day at a car dealership. And the details are currently not known. I hope one day somehow we can uncover them. But what we do know is the next morning his body was found stabbed multiple times on a Druid Hills front lawn, and he never came home that night. The best we can do is learn as much about it as possible. That's an ongoing process. It doesn't end with a marker. Long after our time, someone somewhere could open a box and deepen an archive and learn more about this very important American story.
My name is Celeste Turner. My father was Calvin S. Turner, and his uncle was Porter Flournoy Turner. I'd like to share with you what I call in my father's words. Prior to my father's death, he had a chance to talk with Tia Mitchell of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and share with her and myself some of what he recalled regarding the incident with his uncle Porter, who is my great uncle. I'd like to share that with you. Oh, I was a kid growing up in Atlanta, and he was living in Atlanta with his wife and 2 sons. We were a pretty close family. He was pretty jolly, a really nice guy. I would go over to his house to visit with my 2 cousins. I don't know what his real job was, but I do know he was a jitney. So was my father. Down in Atlanta at that time, That's what they called a hustle. Now, picking up whites was a no-no. But at night, if whites flagged for a cab, he might pick them up. A jitney and a cab. Well, a cab is more like a company, but a jitney is something similar to what you see now. If a person has a lot of bags or groceries that they're trying to bring home, they'll flag down a jitney to take them and give them a ride. Everyone had a car back then, but they weren't always marked or licensed. We knew somebody had killed him. We knew he'd been knifed. He got out of the car and tried to crawl to the house of a doctor that he knew. The next morning, that doctor came outside to go to work and found him on the lawn. That was about all we knew at that time. Then later on, maybe 15 years later, while I was in the service, my mother wrote me a letter. And in that letter, she said that the newspaper had a list of names of people who had been killed by the Ku Klux Klan. His name was on that list. So that was all we knew about it then. My father, he always suspected it was the white people because it happened in their neighborhood. Well, what else can you do when it's an unexpected death? Like so many people being killed on the street now, there's nothing you can do. You bury them. His wife, his 2 sons, they moved to Cleveland, Ohio shortly after that. They were around 7 or 8 years old. I was about 10 or 11 at the time. I joined the Air Force when I was 19 years old, and when I was about 23, I came to Detroit. And then I thought Detroit and Atlanta were a lot alike. But then I found out that in Michigan, there was no death penalty. And I knew at age 23, I would never live in Atlanta or go back to Georgia and live again. They start telling you around 4, 5, 6 years old, you're living in a bad place. You have to be careful about everything. When I was in the 7th grade, a teacher sat some of us down, and she said that by the time you're 21 years old, most of you may be put in jail for one thing or another. That's what it was like in Georgia then. For one reason or another, you had to be very careful down in Georgia. That's what it was like. My name is Celeste Turner, and Porter Flournoy Turner was my great uncle.
blood to wash away those stains. Leave no story untold. Leave no song unturned. Leave no story untold.
So, thank you all for being here today. This was a massive effort on the part of a lot of people, and it's very satisfying after I've been involved with this for 22 months, and it's incredibly satisfying to see this history now public and not just a lost story. Mr. Turner had a real life. He wasn't just a victim. The story is not just about the fact that he was killed. It's about the fact that he was making a living and supporting a family and registering for the draft and working a couple of jobs, and has this amazing family who survives him in descent, who have accomplished a lot, who are Americans, and we all are. Our values aren't represented by this history, but we have to know it and speak the truth and know this history, because if we don't, we'll be victims of history and we'll keep repeating it. Leland said it just beautifully, but I have to read this James Baldwin quote that I just love, and I can't paraphrase him because I could never use words that are as eloquent as his. But he wrote in 1965, "History is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by history in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." In speaking this truth in this beautiful neighborhood that prides itself on being historic, we're taking a step forward. And I applaud the Atlanta City Council, the Olmsted Linear Park Alliance, the Parks and Recreation Department of the City of Atlanta, and the Druid Hills Neighborhood Association. Every one of those groups, which are individual people who had to hear this and learn and realize that they needed to step up. All of those individual people who are members or elected to those organizations and bodies supported this project, and that's meaningful. That means our community is learning and we're making some progress.
This is really kind of a solemn occasion when I think about it. And as the sign was going up, I could feel the emotion begin to rise. It doesn't resolve anything, it just brings to the forefront what the history books do not tell us about. This is part of our family history. Now we get a chance to tell it to our children. Later this month, I will become a great-grandfather for the third time. And so I'll be able to share that with my children. I wasn't necessarily interested in theology, but I've become interested in it. But I want to take this time right now just to thank all of you. To thank Sean and Adrian, who have been dialoguing with us tremendously, folks with NAACP. I did, as you mentioned, you get a chance. That was so moving to go and see what the Equal Justice Institute is doing. I would encourage anyone, regardless of race or creed, to go see that. Because there's something that's really moving about it, even in the silence of just walking through those outdoor exhibits. Just take the time to go to Montgomery and see a lot of this stuff. But we need to come to grips with this race problem in our country. I don't know if this will. I doubt seriously if it will. But each step closer to telling the truth gets us closer to getting some kind of reconciliation, understand that we're all Americans.
Yeah.
Once we get there, nothing will be able to stop us. The only other thing we really need to do is we really need to remember what Jesus said. He said, "Love one another as I have loved you." Until we get to that place in our nation, we will never have the peace, the tranquility, and the prosperity and the leadership that we really can show the rest of the world.
My name is Kayla Vinson. I'm an attorney with the Equal Justice Initiative, and it's an honor to bring remarks on behalf of EJI today. At EJI, we've spent over 30 years representing clients across the country who are deeply vulnerable to the racial injustice that really defines our criminal justice system. And our legal representation has included clients who are facing the death penalty, people who were sentenced to die in prison as children, formerly incarcerated people who are dealing with the many rules and barriers that we put in place that make it very difficult for them to make a life after being released, and people in prisons and jails all over this country who suffer and endure inhumane conditions of confinement. After 20 years of focusing on courtroom advocacy as a way to help our clients, EJI came to understand that there was just no way that people across the United States had a clear understanding of the history of racial injustice. Because if they did, they would see the ways that what happens to our clients on a daily basis is the legacy and the shadow of slavery, and something that must be rooted out of our society. And so, after our first 20 years, we began to usher in an era of truth and justice, where we've invited local communities to join us in ensuring that our public consciousness, our national memory, is one that is rooted in truth-telling, one that tells the truth about the fact that slavery did not end in 1865, but rather it evolved into new systems of racial hierarchy intended to maintain white economic, social, and political control. After slavery ended, we saw a brief period where the nation had the opportunity to, for the first time, become a democracy. And instead, more than 2,000 Black people were lynched during Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877. And the decision to abandon Black people to the very Confederates who had just waged a war against the country ushered in an even longer period of racial terror lynching from 1877 to 1950, during which more than 4,000 Black people were lynched across this country, often in front of large crowds of white men, women, and children. And this number included at least 593 people lynched in the state of Georgia, and at least 4 lynched right here in DeKalb County, including Porter Turner, a Black man who was seized late at night while he was working his second job that he worked in order to provide for his family. But instead, he was brutally attacked and left to die in the Druid Hills neighborhood. And yet, this ceremony is particularly special to me, having grown up in DeKalb County, in a place where I felt and experienced and saw the ways that racial injustice shaped life. But I did not know our local history of racial terror lynching. I didn't know that a lynching happened here as late as 1945. As a world war was being fought against racialized oppression, a Black man was lynched in DeKalb. And a lynching that required the complicity of local law enforcement and state law enforcement and people who were granted impunity even after they had made statements of clear guilt that they had lynched Mr. Turner. And so at EJI, we really think that the public narrative that a nation creates about its communities reflects what matters, who matters, what is remembered. And the absence of any public memorial for Mr. Turner says something about the community in which he was murdered. And so today, it is a joy to join DeKalb County in unveiling this marker, in dedicating this marker on behalf of Mr. Turner, to say no more of this here. That in this community, racialized violence will be remembered and that it must end. DeKalb County is joining a national community of people who are insisting on never again, who are ushering in an era of truth and justice that ideally will identify and name the racial injustice that still exists in this community. so that we can become a place where racial hierarchy does not control outcomes in people's lives. Today and forevermore, the marker to Porter Turner makes a statement about who matters, who is remembered, and what kind of community DeKalb County wants to be. Thank you to the DeKalb County Community Remembrance Coalition, the DeKalb County NAACP for leading this work and ensuring that the horrors and the racial terror violence that took place here will be remembered in order to meaningfully say, never again.